In our society today, when we think of those most in need of our protection, what comes to mind are children. And the myriad ways harm can come to them. However, there is another very vulnerable group which is largely overlooked. More than 500,000 incidents of abuse against elderly Americans are reported to authorities every year, and millions more go unreported. In California alone, statistics show an astounding increase in elder abuse. California Social Services has seen the number of reports rise 23% over the past few years. Shockingly, more than 30% of the perpetrators are family members. Only 1 in 5 cases of elder abuse is even reported. Currently, more than 3.7 million Californians are 65 or older.
This is PACE TV. I'm Mike Ruppel, and today we will learn how to recognize the types of elder abuse and what resources are available for getting help. Our guest has devoted his professional life to the protection of the elderly and the prosecution of the criminals. For over 13 years, he has served as Deputy District Attorney, head of the Elder Abuse Unit of the Family Protection Division here in the San Diego County DA's office. I am honored to introduce Paul Greenwood. Paul, thank you for being here. Welcome to PACE.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome. Now, Paul, this is a fantastic subject to discuss. What is the extent of the widespread problem here in the elder abuse San Diego County?
Well, one of the challenges we face, Mike, is the fact that we really don't understand how deep this problem is. I mean, I've been prosecuting these cases, as you say, for 13 years, and in that time I've seen a noted escalation in the number of cases coming into my office. But one of the major problems is that so often the crime goes undetected, uninvestigated, and therefore unprosecuted, because primarily many of the victims of elder abuse are too afraid or too embarrassed to come forward to admit. So we have to rely upon others in the community to be watchful and to report these cases. And so how extensive the problem is, we just don't know, but we know that it's serious and it's escalating.
Really? Now, Paul, what resources are available for people to get some help when there's a situation like that?
Well, we're very fortunate in San Diego County. We do have so many resources at our fingertips. We have a tremendous agency called AIS, and that really is the umbrella organization for so many different outlets. For example, AIS in the summer months offers a cool zone program for seniors. So when the temperature, particularly in the East County, reaches 95 degrees or more, then elders know where to go as a refuge to get cooled down. And within that umbrella organization, we have Adult Protective Services, who actually provide responses when people call in to the reporting line. Then Adult Protective Services actually goes out and makes calls unannounced on particular elders that we are concerned about.
I see. Now, the AIS is the Aging and Independent Services?
That's right, and they are the county agency that is the umbrella organization with so many different resources available.
I see. And the APS is the Adult Protective Services?
That's right.
And what is there a relationship between the two, an affiliation?
Oh yes, I mean the Adult Protective Services is one finger of AIS, and they provide, as I say, the on-the-spot response when people call in to this reporting line number.
I see. Now, of course, then you have your office, the District Attorney's Office, as part of that resource package, would you say?
Yes, and what I'm very proud of is the fact that we work so very closely with AIS and Adult Protective Services. We're on various multidisciplinary teams with them, and we are sharing emails, phone calls, and this is somewhat unusual because a lot of prosecutors' offices don't have this same intimate contact with their local AIS offices, and I'm just very proud of the relationships we've built up. And one of the reasons is there's been a consistency over the 13 years. There's been very little turnover in staff, so we've developed good working relationships with one another, and there's a very ease of communication between the various departments.
That's wonderful. That's great. Now, let's talk about the APS itself. What specific services do they provide?
Well, when people are concerned or suspect that somebody is the victim of elder abuse, they will probably call, we hope, the 1-800 number, 1-800-510-2020. And that again is a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week number where they will get a human being on the other end of the phone, and details will be taken down, and then Adult Protective Services will, as time allows and as cases allow, send out a representative, a caseworker, to the home of this elderly person about whom concern has been expressed, unannounced. And this is the key. The Adult Protective Service worker will never divulge who made the call. And the frustration that APS have is that if they come to the door of an elder and the elder says, "No, I don't want your help, go away," that's exactly what has to happen.
I see.
So they're not people who push their way into situations, but when they're there, they're very trained to assess if they believe that there is some form of abuse going on. And if the APS worker senses that, then they will cross-report to law enforcement and encourage them to do an investigation. And then after the investigation is completed, that's when it ends up on my desk for potential prosecution.
Interesting, very interesting. Now, let's talk about the various types of abuse. It runs a full gamut, I'm sure. And I understand you have physical abuse, obviously, abandonment, neglect, all of these that come under the heading of abuse. Financial abuse, self-neglect, which I'm sure is a whole different concept, and then mental suffering. But for our purposes today, Paul, let's concentrate on financial abuse and physical abuse, probably the most difficult maybe to deal with. So there are, I understand, 10 steps that you recommend that people adhere to protect themselves from financial abuse.
Well, I do, and I've sort of picked up these 10 steps through the 13 years of prosecuting cases of financial exploitation, and I've just assembled these tips that I share with senior groups around the county and beyond. And I have to say that about 70% of all my cases that I prosecute involve some form of financial exploitation. And I believe that if we were to adopt some or all of these tips, then we might be able to reduce the number of situations in which an elderly person is victimized financially. So for example, choose a caregiver with caution, because unfortunately there's a lot of convicted felons out there in San Diego who are being hired by caregiver agencies as caregivers. And so families need to be very careful who they hire and make sure they ask around with bonded insured agencies, what background checks have you done? Secondly, we need to keep an inventory of all the jewelry. Jewelry is the #1 item that is stolen in San Diego County from elderly females. And so we need to keep photographed and videotaped and keep it locked up at all times. Thirdly, to have a shredder in the home and dispose of any items that you're going to throw away by shredding them, so that no information about yourself ends up in the trash without it being shredded. Fourthly, there is so much mailbox theft in San Diego County, and that could be avoided if every person had a locked mailbox, if it's accessible on the street to an ordinary person. Fifthly, all of us need to do credit searches on ourselves at least 3 times a year. The chances of you and I becoming victims of identity theft are enormous. And one of the ways of protecting us from being victims, or at least finding out about it, is to do a credit search at least 3 times a year. Sixthly, we have to encourage seniors to use caller ID on their telephones. A lot of crooks now are using the telephone as their primary weapon. And so to have caller ID, and if it shows up as private, unknown, or out of area, at least it gives us mentally a few seconds to prepare for the fact that the person on the other end of the phone might just be a crook. Number 7, I keep reminding people you'll never ever win the Canadian lottery. This is a common scam that is being perpetrated in San Diego, and unfortunately in the current economy, when somebody is calling a senior and promising them that they've won $150,000, logic seems to go out of the window. But it's a scam every single time. And number 8, for those elders who have sight problems, particularly those who are fully blind, I'm advocating that a copy of the bank statement or the credit union statement goes to a trusted family member or financial advisor, because then another pair of eyes can take a look at the bank statement every 30 days, and if somebody's account is being contaminated, then at least another pair of eyes will spot it within the first month. Number 9, be very careful when you hire a handyman, because in California, everybody who does a job for over $500 for home repair must be licensed by the state of California. Check with the Better Business Bureau. Check with the Contractor State License Board before you ever commit to hiring a contractor, because you only want to deal with a licensed contractor. And finally, everybody should have a secure front line of defense at the front door, either a peephole or a chain guard or a screen door which is locked, so that you don't allow anybody in your home without knowing who they are. And particularly, don't just allow them in if they come in a uniform. You need to check first with the agency that they are representing by getting on the telephone and saying, is this person legitimate?
Right. I remember one thing you said. I had the pleasure of attending one of your sessions. On your mailbox outside, the red flag up is a signal to the thieves.
Absolutely it is. I'm convinced that the red flag was invented by a crook. Because right now, as we're speaking, I'm sure there are crooks driving around San Diego County looking for those red flags being raised, although actually today is a county holiday, so the mailmen are not there. But they're looking for these mailboxes with letters in them so they can just go in and reach out and steal them.
And when they steal them, if there's a check in there, they have your bank account, they have your bank account number, they have your signature.
And they do, and then they'll take photocopies of that, scan them, but then they'll also use very clever chemicals to white out the payee and put their name in. And I've seen these checks, obviously, because I prosecute the cases. You hold them up to the naked light, you cannot tell the difference. It has to be under a special light to notice that it has been contaminated.
Right. I've heard situations, Paul, where people come to an elderly person's door, bang on the door, there's been a terrible accident, I need to use a telephone, and instinctively they open the door.
That's right. And of course, these crooks know that if they knock on the door of an elder, they're relying upon the compassion, the trustworthiness that the elders exude, and of course they want to help. Some of the scams involve young ladies with a baby, and they'll come to the door in the summer and say, my baby's taken ill, can I please come in and have a glass of water? And then when the back is turned, when they're in the kitchen getting the water, they're in the bedroom stealing the jewelry and the checks.
I understand sometimes they work in pairs.
They do. Tree trimmers is a good scam. They'll knock on the door, say, we're tree trimmers, we're trimming your neighbor's trees behind. Can we please come and look at the tree from your side of the fence? So the unsuspecting victim will go down the side passageway with one of the tree trimmers, while the other one is in the front of the house stealing the jewelry and the credit cards.
Yeah. Now tell us, Paul, this Canadian lottery, or it could be some other scam from some other part of the world, how do they get the money from you, from the victim, I should say?
Well, what they do is a number of ways. They'll either on the phone call say, before we can send you the money, you need to wire us the taxes that are payable in the province of Quebec or Ontario, and so you need to wire us $4,000 today. So we want you to go to your bank, withdraw the money, go to MoneyGram, and wire the money up to Canada. Or what they might also do is send a bogus check for $150,000 and then call you up and say, okay, you've got your check, deposit it in your bank, but when you deposit it, please wire us the money. And here's the problem. Often the banks and the credit unions aren't trained to spot that these are bogus checks. And it takes 10 working days sometimes for the banks to realize that these are bogus checks. In the meantime, the victim has sent the $5,000 to the crooks.
Amazing. They're very clever, aren't they?
Well, they are, and they're coming up with new scams all the time, and that's why we've got to keep up with it and keep educating the public about these new scams. The latest one right now is the grandma scam, where the crook is calling up an elderly female and saying, Grandma? And she's not sure who it is, and she says, is that you, Eric? And now he has his identity, and he gives her a story about how he's stranded in another city, he's in jail, and he needs bail money of $5,000. And so that scam is now being perpetrated.
It's never ending, is it?
It's not. It keeps me on my toes, but it makes me more and more determined to stay up with these crooks, to draw them in battle and show them that we're not going to just take it and we're going to go after them aggressively, and when we can, catch them and aggressively prosecute them.
Good for you. The shredder, I have one myself, is invaluable. I mean, there's so many things that have your identification on them nowadays that it's almost imperative that we each have a shredder at home.
Well, it is, and we affectionately refer to these crooks as dumpster divers, and they are. That's their occupation. They spend their life sifting through people's trash, looking for those disused, discarded credit card applications, which are already pre-printed, sometimes even with pre-printed checks on them, and that's what they use to their advantage.
And of course, that comes under the heading of identity theft.
Yes, and a large section of the population who are victims of identity theft are the seniors. And primarily because seniors are the people who are least likely to do credit searches and therefore not become aware that they are victims of identity theft until the debt collectors are knocking on the door some 8 months later looking for payment for the $10,000 that has been racked up in the name of the victim.
Now, I've heard some terrible stories about contractors and people who come to your home to repair things, and before you know it, the homeowner has got a lien against their house for some alleged unpaid bill. What can you tell us about that?
Well, you have to be so careful with whom you contract. Certainly, you should not contract with a person who knocks on the door and says, you know, I'm in the area, I happen to be doing other people's work, would you like me to give you a cheap quote? You need to do your homework, and I always say get 3 estimates, and before you sign any contract, you check with the Better Business Bureau and you check with the Contractor State License Board to see if there are any complaints against these individuals. There's a group of traveling criminals, and sometimes they refer to themselves as gypsies, who make an occupation of targeting elderly homeowners in this area, and they are trying to do driveways, re-roofing, and all those kinds of occupations. But the materials they use are inferior, they don't have any warranties, and they overcharge. The problem, Mike, is that so often when the elderly person realizes they've been ripped off, they're too embarrassed to tell us. And so these crimes go undetected.
Terrible, terrible. The situation with elder abuse, financial, is almost unending. But there's also another part of the abuse situation, which is physical abuse.
That's right.
Which is so much, I don't know if it's so much more serious, but we seem to feel more empathy toward people who are physically abused. Now, how is your office dealing with that? What have you found to be the cause and effect, and what are some of the signs to look for, the trouble signs?
I teach this around the country, which is the profile of the #1 perpetrator of physical abuse. It's a son living in San Diego County. And the typical victim is his mother, who's a widow. And this perpetrator, the son, is in his late 40s to early 50s. He's living at home with his widowed mother, either because he is divorced and come back to live at home, or he's just returned from prison, or thirdly, he's single and has never, ever left home. And here's the problem. Why should he leave home when his mother is very much an enabler? She cooks him 3 meals a day, she washes his socks and his handkerchiefs, and she irons them. She doesn't charge him any rent, and he's lazy. He's unemployed, and he uses as an excuse his, quote, medical condition, which so often turns out to be a bad back. He's often addicted to drugs, alcohol, or gambling. And because these cost money to feed the addiction, he's stealing the money from his own mother. Typically, he will steal her jewelry and pawn it. He will tear out the check from the back of the checkbook and forge that, or he'll cash her Social Security check. And when the mother finds out, she confronts him, and that's when he reacts by hitting her, first of all, in the eye. And if we don't catch it now, that violence of hitting his mother in the eye will escalate to pushing her down the stairs, and even worse, to killing his own mother.
Wow, terrible. And I'm sure you've seen many cases like this in San Diego County. And I guess we'll get into that a little later, but I guess my first point is, as a civilian, for lack of a better term, a neighbor, if you will, and if we suspect that there's physical abuse in our neighborhood, or a neighbor we know or someone we know might be being abused physically. She is injuring herself all the time, and it looks physically injured. What does the civilian do?
And this is a big part of what I feel is my job, is to go out to the community and urge people to become more vigilant about their neighbors and about their families. The problem here in Southern California is so often we use this excuse, well, it's none of my business. But it is our business. And of course, the elders are the most cherished of our population. And so there are certain red flags. If you see a sign of change of behavior, maybe you haven't seen your elderly neighbor come out into the street. She used to go shopping every Wednesday or go to the beauty parlor every Thursday morning. Now she doesn't do that. Why not? And so if you have concerns about somebody being isolated or that somebody has moved in with them, then go with your gut feeling and make that call to Adult Protective Services at 1-800-510-2020. Because nobody is going to criticize you for making that call. Number one, you can be anonymous if you wish. You don't have to tell Adult Protective Services who you are. You can just say, hey, I've got these concerns. So often, Mike, I get the call from a member of the public after the elderly person is already deceased. Oh. And they're beginning to tell me all these stories of either of financial exploitation or of physical neglect. And I try to control myself, but I'm saying, why didn't you call me 6 months ago? Well, I didn't think it was appropriate. And so we want the community to be much more vigilant and assertive and make that call to APS.
Well, you outlined the fact that the call is anonymous, which I think will be a relief to some people who feel they may have made a mistake and they hesitate to call because they don't want to be pointed to and said, well, you're a busybody. So an anonymous call will get the job done, at least get somebody on the scene to evaluate the situation.
It will, and it could possibly, that call could possibly save the life of an elder. It's amazing how many times Adult Protective Services have gone in as the first line of defense, have gone into a home and found an elderly person in squalor, living in damp conditions, with filth, with feces, with rats, cockroaches, and we've actually saved them from perhaps a slow death. And so you should never regret making that call. I have found that APS workers and Aging and Independent Services are very sensitive. They won't just go in there as a bulldozer and rip apart a family dynamic. No, they want to work with a family and try to restore and bring in resources to help. And maybe that's all it needs, is a resource that the family were not aware of that APS or Aging and Independent Services can provide. It's not necessarily ending up in prosecution.
I see. And it could be that someone is just sick, hasn't been seen for a while, and rather than just mind your own business, pick up that phone and say, I think there's something wrong at so-and-so address, and have somebody come take a look.
Exactly. Rather than live with your conscience when you find out, when the paramedics turn up 4 weeks later to find this person laying on the floor who's been neglected there and not being attended to for several weeks. You don't want to have that on your conscience.
Yeah, and it could be someone who fell and slipped and couldn't get up. I mean, we see that commercial on TV, but it's a serious aspect to that, where a person living alone could fall and not be able to reach for help.
Exactly. And this is why this program, this message is so important, not just for seniors, but it's for the adult children of seniors to be more proactive with their elderly parents, to keep an eye out for them, even if they live 1,000 miles away from their parents. Or for the neighbor who lives next door to an elderly person. We're asking good San Diego citizens to be a little more vigilant and watchful and proactive, not to become nosy, but just to be sensitive to the needs of the elderly person living next door.
Right. Like the old saying, call your mother.
That's right. Call your mother. Or in my case, I went to see my mother last week for Mother's Day in England. And that was special.
Yes, and of course you haven't got a New York accent or an American accent, and you are British, I understand, and been here how many years now?
I've been here now 19 years. I live and married to my wonderful San Diego wife of 30 years, Sue, who's the love of my life. And she brought me here back in 1991. I was a lawyer in England for 13 years. And then we came here back to her hometown. It's been a wonderful, wonderful move.
Wonderful. Lucky for us, because you're an advocate. and we appreciate that very much.
Well, I'm fortunate to live in a great county where I think we've been able to demonstrate county agencies work very well together, and we believe we're making a difference in the lives of seniors in this county.
Well, I've said it before on other occasions that we're very lucky to be in San Diego for many reasons. We're running a little short of time, Paul, but I'd like to just bring the viewer into your world and how you respond to a need, usually from APS, I presume.
Yes, APS will make that first initial call, but they will then cross-refer to law enforcement, and then APS and law enforcement will contact me at a certain point and provide a case, and I will then look at that case and decide if charges can be prosecuted against an individual.